this disease by the common names such as Annosum root disease, Annosum root rot, or Fomes root rot. Each time the scientific name has changed, the common name has changed. Until about, I don't know, 10 years ago, 6 years ago, we had one name. It's been Heterobasidion Annosum. Before that it was Fomes annosus. However, with the ability to look at fungi from a genetic standpoint, the pathogen which causes Heterobasidion root disease has been differentiated into many different species. In the south, we have just Heterobasidion irregulare. This species affects pines. It also affects incensier and junipers as well. It's very important. I'm kind of dwelling on the different name changes because it is important that you know the different common names, since many of your clients or landowners will probably remember various names. Much older landowners tend to remember Fomes. Some people that have gone through school more recently will remember Annosum. And also, when you look in the literature, you're going to see all these various names. So it's important that you recognize the old names and know that we're talking about the same disease. Heterobasidion root disease is the second most important root disease in southern pine plantations. The greatest occurrence of this disease is in thinned pine plantations on sandy, well-drained soils. Also in the mountains, it is very common on thinned eastern white pine. Trees affected by Heterobasidion root disease can have thinning crowns with shortened and yellowed needles. Windthrow is another common symptom of this disease. The disease causes, or the fungus, the pathogen causes the root systems to decay, and so when windstorms occur, trees are windthrown. In the early stages of decay, roots often look like this, where you have a lot of resin soaking. I just want to note that you would need a lab to do the diagnostics to confirm the presence of Heterobasidion irregulare in these root samples, because some diseases can have similar symptoms of at least pitch soaking, for example. So I oftentimes will get samples like this sent to me for ID. As the disease progresses, a white pocket rot develops, and it eventually becomes like a white stringy rot, as you can see here. This is very characteristic of this disease, this white stringy rot. Identification of the fruiting bodies, or conchs, is another way to diagnose Heterobasidion root disease, and probably the way you would try to identify it. These conchs develop under wet, cool conditions. In the south, you want to look for these conchs during the wintertime. They are often found buried in the duff around the base of trees or stumps, and so it's important that you actually kick the duff away from the base of the tree if you want to actually see these conchs or find them. The conchs tend to be, when they're fresh, rubbery, and the underside is a nice white color. If you take a hand lens, you will see the spores are irregular in shape. This down here, this fourth picture right here, are the small type of buttons that you will get in the beginning of the development of the conch, or sometimes you see this in the summertime when it's really hot and dry and you just get enough cool, wet conditions for the pathogen to try to form some spores and some pores to produce spores. And this is why you can get a little bit of spore formation in the summertime, even when it's been fairly hot and dry. So this slide shows spore production that occurs below the 34 north degree latitude line. That line cuts through South Carolina, cuts South Carolina in half, goes through the north of Georgia and the north of Alabama. So this data is from below that. And this data is also the basis for why we can recommend summer thinning, which can be used below this 34 north degree latitude line. Conchs and spore production is greatest in the wintertime, as you can see here, September through May, and especially in December, November, December, January is when the bulk of spores are produced. Typically, there are lower spore production in June through August, and so we can recommend summer thinning without stump treatment, and but that's only below the 34 north degree latitude line, and only if the mean temperature, see here, is above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If you get a cool, wet summer, every once in a while you do get a cool, wet summer, and stump treatments may still be necessary then in the summer, because you still can get conchs to form if you have the right conditions in the summertime. Again, if you're above that 34 north degree latitude line, summer thinning is not an option. A stand becomes infected by Heterobasidion irregulare when spores fall on newly exposed sapwood, which is selective for Heterobasidion irregulare for up to 2 weeks. We estimate that 90% of the infection in stands occurs through stumps, but there is a possibility of a possibility of root infection, which we estimate to be somewhere around 10%. I oftentimes will, not oftentimes, but every once in a while someone will mention that they used stump treatment, yet they still got some Annosum in their stand, and I would guess that it's probably from direct root infection. The pathogen then can spread to neighboring healthy trees through root contacts or root grafts. And this is how the disease affects your healthy stand. I want to talk a little bit about root infections. Soils in the south are given a hazard rating, and I will talk more in depth about the hazard rating in a few minutes. But in high hazard soils, which happen to be sandy, well-drained soils, you get greater root contact. And the other thing that can happen is you have spores that can move through sand and directly infect roots. The way that the reason that you don't have this happening in unthinned stands is because with an intact O horizon, that inhibits the spore movement. It stays up in that O horizon and it doesn't actually percolate through the sand. However, when we do a thinning or a removal, when we're pulling trees out and with equipment, we often disturbed that O horizon layer and we end up with pure sand. And that's why one of the reasons high hazard soils are considered high hazard is because of that sandy soil texture. The spores can actually percolate down and infect roots directly. So if you can do anything to keep that O horizon intact, you will be reducing that possibility of infection. Low hazard soils are clay soils, high clay, One of the reasons that they're low hazard is because there's a lower root contact potential. Spores do not move through the clay to the roots. However, if you thin and you create these kind of roots being exposed, you can get infection to those root systems, obviously. Heterobasidion root diseases cause a outward spreading type infection by their root-to-root contact, which creates these like circular centers of disease, as you can see here. So you get these spots or area of mortality. One way to try to tell whether or not you're looking at root disease versus a beetle spot, for example, is the progression of mortality. In this picture, which may be kind of hard to see, there's actually a tree on the ground. Behind there's a tree that died like a year ago, and then these trees died in the year that the picture was taken. And this is how you should begin to think, well, I probably have a root disease, because root disease is spread in a very methodical, slow way, so you get this year-by-year mortality over time. Bark beetles are always associated with these spots, and unfortunately, people have sometimes misdiagnosed the problem that they're seeing as a bark beetle spot and not thought about whether or not they have an actual root disease component to the spot. Here's an example of a spot that is not root disease. I got called out to look at this for root disease, and one of the first telltale signs was all the trees appeared to have died all at the same time. The type of things that cause that to happen are insects, such as a southern pine beetle, for example, fire, herbicide, and in this case, it actually was excessive herbicide being sprayed before putting up the equipment for the night, and it just happened to kill off the tree. So just wanted to give you an example of what would not be a root disease to help you diagnose it in the field. This is a model of how Heterobasidion root disease develops in your stand. It takes 10 years before a spot will stabilize. So here you have your pathogen activity, Heterobasidion irregulare. You have your tree damage and mortality, windthrow, and then here are your possible bark beetle attacks. And as you can see, in the first year, maybe you'll get one tree. Second year, maybe one or two. Maybe your first one will happen the second year. By the third year, you're starting to see some mortality. Fourth and fifth is usually when there's enough mortality that you may have to take action, typically, or it's noticed. You notice it. If bark beetles get into the site, then you can actually end up with a complete wipeout, which I've seen at least once. Otherwise, if bark beetles don't get into the site, you'll see the mortality will decline over time. So that's how it develops in the stand. This is an example of a stand the fourth year after thinning. Above ground, in this area that we looked, there was 15% mortality, but when we did some plots looking at the root systems, which I'll go into depth a little later in this talk, we found 30% root infection below ground. So what you see above ground, maybe half of what's actually going on below ground. And at the time, the owner wanted to wait and see if it was only going to be 15%, he was actually okay with that. But because of the below ground root disease, it actually expanded considerably, and by the next year, he was forced to clear cut. This is another example. In this case, they had, this was the fifth year after thinning, and they had one spot of Heterobasidion root disease per acre. But on the south side of this particular stand, there had been a drought, and it was on the south side, and Ips beetles went from the Heterobasidion Root Disease spots to the adjacent trees that were under drought pressure, and you got this kind of damage. And this actually happened on a medium hazard soil. So later I'll be talking about the probability of potential losses like this on a medium hazard soil, and typically it's only 30 to 40% probability, but it can happen. In the mountains, eastern white pine is highly susceptible to Heterobasidion root disease, and it doesn't matter what soils it's on. If you have a pure stand, or especially if you have a recreation site that is mostly white pine, you need to be proactive with this disease because it's highly susceptible. As far as the relative susceptibility of other southern pines, there was a bunch of work done by Hodges on the Savannah River site, and what they basically found is loblolly pine was the most susceptible. It can have a max growth rate of 2 meters per year in the root systems. Slash pine is medium, a little bit less, and then longleaf pine had half the mortality and a much lower progression of the disease in the root system. So this is why, it's based on this information, is why we often will recommend planting longleaf pine on high hazard sites, because it is less susceptible to this root disease. So here's a map of the soil hazard rating for Heterobasidion root disease, and as you can see, the red here is high hazard for Annosum root disease, the brown is medium hazard, and then this light colored is low hazard. So low hazards are clay and clay-loams, any soil with a high water table 2 or more months out of the year, and it has a maybe a 10%, 20% probability of severe loss. Moderate hazard are loam or silt loams, or it can be a sandy soil, but with a clay horizon less than a foot from the surface. And here you have a possible 30 to 40% probability of severe loss. And finally, in our high hazard soils, sandy loams, or loamy sands with a minimum of 12 inches deep or deeper. And these are well-drained soils. So they, unlike the coast here, where you can get wintertime flooding, these soils up here in the wintertime stay dry. And you have a 75 to 85% probability of loss on those high hazard sites. Other factors that enhance Heterobasidion root disease are the number of thinnings. So the more thinnings you have, the more disease will develop in your stand. Anything that weakens trees, such as drought or suppression, we know that the pathogen will grow faster in the root systems of a weakened tree. The problem is more severe on neutral to alkaline soil conditions. Obviously, pines prefer a more acidic environment or acidic soil. And finally, we find it more often in former agricultural sites or severe disease problems on former agricultural sites as compared to natural stands. So now I'm going to go into stump treatments. The first stump treatment that is available to you is Cellutreat. It's a wettable borate powder. There's been some changes recently to the label. Prior to, I'm actually not sure exactly when they changed it, but there used to be a label that was specific for treating stumps to control Heterobasidion Annosum. Notice that they use the old name here, Heterobasidion Annosum, Heterobasidion irregulare in the south, and they advised a 5 pound per gallon or a 5% solution. 1 gallon of that 5% solution will treat about 250 6-inch stumps to 90 10-inch stumps. If you look at the new label, they don't talk about the 5% solution. They talk about a 10% to even a 15% solution. You could use the 10% solution, just understand that you're going to be spreading it twice as thin. I personally think we, for treating stumps, should stick with the 5% solution. And if you go to NICES's website, they do have under timber harvesting this little pamphlet, and in here it talks about using 1 pound per 2 gallons, which is the 5% solution. So we have done studies with it at this level. It should control the problem just well. When you use Cellutreat, what you are actually doing is sealing the stump surface from infection. And it works very well, especially in a site that has never been thinned before. The next stump treatment is a biological control that's Flebiopsis gigantea. Flebiopsis gigantea is a fungus that occurs naturally throughout the northern hemisphere. The problem is that you need a high dose of those spores on the stump surface prior to infection by Heterobasidion irregulare to truly get control. So you can't just hope for natural infection to take care of this problem. We have had this stump treatment in the past in the South. We had it available from the 1970s, about mid-1970s to 1995. A company called BioBasic produced it. Unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, but the laws for controlling the labeling of pesticides changed, and biologicals, which once in the 70s they said we could use without a label, required a label, which is a very expensive and time-consuming thing to have, and it took 21 years for this treatment to be available again. But I'm very pleased that it is available again to us. It is a living spore which has been dried down and put into a silica, and it's hard to describe the other things in this product, but it can be rehydrated again when you put it into water. 1 gallon treats 250 6-inch stumps, much like the Cellutreat does if you use the 5% solution. The thing about rot stop is that it must be stored at cool temperatures. You can store it for 12 months at refrigeration temperature or for 18 months in the freezer. You also have to be careful when you take it out in the field. You need to carry it in a cooler because you do not want to leave it in a hot car, or the heat will kill the spores. It can get like an oven inside a car. So it's very important that you keep it in a small cooler like you would use for your lunch right before you apply it. And you need to, once you mix this, you need to apply it within 24 hours or less, hopefully less. This particular treatment is a biological. So what it does is it actually outcompetes Heterobasidion irregulare for the stump. It actually will grow into the stump, in fact. So that's one of its benefits. The last thing I wanted to tell you about this particular treatment is if you use this with a backpack sprayer, for example, you need to remove the screen in the nozzle head, because it can, the product can end up clogging that screen. So just a small little note if you decide to use this particular stump treatment. I've talked somewhat about the summer thinning option before, but here in this map you can see this line here is where that 34 north degree latitude line is. And so in this area below it, you could use the summer thinning option in January July and August, as long as the mean temperatures stay above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So another reason why summer thinning can work here in the south is the elevated daytime temperatures of a stump surface can actually get above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And over a couple hours at that temperature, it will kill the pathogen that causes Heterobasidion root disease. So this is an option in some places. If you're above that line, it is not an option. So here are the basic management options for prevention. So let's say, and in the Forest Service, we really push for this type of prevention to be on high hazard soils. Any stands that you have on high hazard soils, please think about prevention of Heterobasidion root disease. First, we always like to stress that it would be a good idea to plant longleaf pine on these deep sandy soils that are well drained. Reduce the need for thinning, so use maybe wider spacing, so you maybe only have to thin once. The use of stump treatments for the first anytime you thin, and summer thinning, again, only if you're in that location where it would be beneficial, or would work, actually. If you have an infected stand, it really doesn't matter what soil type you have. Depending on the level of infection, you may decide to do nothing. If it's 10% and it will still meet your goals, you may just decide to monitor it for potential bark beetle attack. But other than that, you may decide to do nothing. If you decide to do a thinning or a salvage with the thinning, then we would recommend that you use the Rot Stop C. As opposed to using the Cellutrete. The Cellutrete seals the stump, which the potential then for the disease to move through, or the pathogen to move through the roots, through the stump and on to adjacent trees is possible. And by using a biological control, you're reducing that risk, because the theory anyway is that the Blebiopsis gigantea will grow down into the stump, and so it will outcompete the Annosum from moving through that stump. So the other option, if you again are below that 34 north degree latitude line, you could use summer thinning when you do a thinning salvage. Obviously, if the infection is high and you're not going to meet, it's no longer going to be able to meet what you want, you may need to harvest. And then only in recreation sites, orchards, or in urban type settings would you use stump removal. That's pretty expensive, but it does work. It's just very expensive. I often get asked if people should use fertilizer when they have a infected stand to help control it or help the trees, and the answer is no, I don't advise it. One is because any type of fertilizer that has ammonium nitrate or nitrogen in it not only does not decrease the spread of Heterobasidion root disease in your stand, but it actually, on high levels of fertilizer, there's some evidence that it could increase it. There has been some mixed results with studies where you have nitrogen-free and slow-release compound fertilizers, but I really question whether or not you'll get enough effect to make it worth the cost. So I don't advise this type of treatment. So how do you determine how much infection that you have, how much root infection you have? The cubic foot method is what we suggest. You dig out a cube of soil 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot deep, and you collect all the roots, see in his hand, and you do a tally of symptomatic roots versus total roots. And you do that for each plot. Try to do at least 20, well, we recommend 20, but as many as you can do. And if you tally all these, you should get a % root disease. Once you have an idea of how much actual root disease you have, you can go to this decision key. And if you have an existing stand, an existing plantation, a high hazard site, so this is a deep sandy soil, well drained, and let's say it's a first thinning, then you would treat new stumps with either Celutreat or Rot Stop C, or again, if you're in the area where you can effectively use summer thinning, use summer thinning. If you actually have a high hazard site with 10 to 40% root infection in it, again, your options are, depending on the level and what your plans are for that site, no action. If you do thin or salvage, we recommend that you use the Rot Stop Stump Treatment or cut in summer if you're in that zone, or harvest. And then finally, in the Forest Service, we always recommend once the root disease gets to above 40% that you harvest when practical. If you have a low hazard site, and for the purposes of this key, we have put the medium hazard in with the low hazard. We would just suggest normal management if you have no root disease in the stand. If, however, you have Heterobasidion irregulare mortality going on, then we're back to a similar decision as if you were on a high hazard site. No action, thin and salvage with Rot Stop, or cut in the summer, or if it's bad enough or you have bark beetles hitting the site, then you would harvest. And of course, once you hit above a 40% root disease level, you need to harvest as soon as possible. In recreation sites, it really doesn't matter what soil type you have. You should always treat stumps. And if you have a recreation site that is pure, like white pine, for example, I usually recommend that it be converted to hardwoods, especially if you have disease in it. But as you remove diseased trees, definitely treat with Rot Stop, or if you can afford to, do stump removal. If there is no root disease in the site, then always treat new stumps. We're very fortunate in the South that our stumps and our roots break down fast. And because of this, we do, in regeneration, have a little bit of loss, but we always end up with a fully stocked stand after 15 years or so. Seedling losses can occur, especially those seedlings that are right up against a stump, as you can see here. You'll lose that individual seedling, but because the root systems are not interconnected, you won't get a spread of the disease. So I personally have only seen one stand with 8% loss from this disease after 6 years, and then I ended up with a fully stocked stand when we came back at 15 years, so I've seen this firsthand. And in that one study site, I was monitoring 10 different stands, and this only happened in one stand in particular. So we do plant enough seedlings that you kind of expect some losses, and so we found, and there's actually a 22-year study by Coleman with 6 different species and 2 different sites, which showed that they had 6% loss to seedlings of Heterobasidion root disease, but by the time they hit 22 years and came back, it was a fully stocked stand. So we do not recommend that you wait to regenerate. When you're regenerating an area that's high hazard, again, to be proactive, we recommend that you use wide spacing to delay thinning, and that you, again, as I said before, consider planting longleaf pine on these deep, sandy, well-drained soils. And if you have any other type of soil, either low hazard, and we, as I said before, we collapse the medium hazard in with the low hazard for this decision key, and normal management, unless you choose otherwise. And I'm ready to take any questions that you have.
All right, thank you, Michelle. And just in case anyone missed it, that's Ms. Michelle Cram with the U.S. Forest Service, Forest Health Protection here in Athens, Georgia. And we have a few questions, and we will start right away here. The first one we have, how low in the soil can spores spread, meaning how deep into what horizon?
Coleman's study, I believe it went at least a minimum of 10 centimeters, and I believe it could actually go a little bit deeper than that. But I'd have to look it up. I know at least 10 centimeters.
And then after a thinning or a harvest, how quickly do the stumps need to be treated?
They need to be treated within a day.
On one of your slides, this was your susceptibility slide where you had loblolly, slash, and longleaf. I think there was a little confusion as to how those fell out. One question was, I believe one was 50% less susceptible than another, but I don't think it was clear sort of what that was. Could you go over the different susceptibility of the southern pines again for us?
Okay, so loblolly pine is the most susceptible, and it has a growth rate of the fungus in the root systems of 1.3 meters up to 2 meters in a year. That's per year growth rate. The next one is slash, which has a growth rate of 1.1, so it's medium. And then the least susceptible is longleaf pine, which had a growth rate of 0.8 meters per year. And in that study, it was monitored for a 5-year period. They had 50% less mortality in the longleaf plots than they did in the loblolly plots in particular.
And is there any data on shortleaf pine?
No, I'm not on susceptibility, no.
One question that just came in was on longleaf stands that had to be cut and replaced because of Heterobasidion Root Disease. Are there special considerations for replacing those stands? Special management considerations?
Well, the fortunate thing is that we basically have a restart button by clear cutting. So when you clear cut, you can replant immediately. It is possible that you could lose up to 10% of your seedlings because the seedlings, when they come in contact with an infected root or stump, that individual seedling may die. But you should have a fully stocked stand by the time 15, 20 years roll around.
Can the Heterobasidion spores be spread on harvesting equipment and carried from stand to stand that way?
I haven't heard of that happen. Honestly, there's enough spore load in the air that that's a minor worry.
And it may have been mentioned, but we talked about cellutreat. Is that impacted by temperature as far as the application? I know you said that we can't let it get too warm, while you have it with you and holding it. But as far as field application, is there an upper or lower temperature we should be aware of?
Well, cellutreat is the borate. So that is that, to my knowledge, doesn't have a temperature concern other than you are applying a liquid. And so obviously, when temperatures get super freezing, which doesn't tend to happen in the south to the point where you can't apply treatment, but yeah, that would be your only concern with cellutreat. As far as the rot stop, in normal temperatures you should be able to apply it. They do have there's the ability to add something to help you with freezing temperatures. It's on the label. It's basically you're adding a 10% antifreeze type product, I believe, at 10%. But look at the label. It has it in there so that you could go to where you have almost freezing temperatures and still apply it.
Okay, Michelle, my final question is from me, and it's something I feel like we should just briefly touch on. And there's been some talk the last few years in the South about some other root fungi and some other pine decline is what it's been called. So I was hoping you could just quickly address the relationship between the thing called southern pine decline and Heterobasidion root disease, and maybe relationships with Heterobasidion and other root fungi that are present here, and just touch on that a little bit for folks.
Okay. So pine decline is a condition where your stand starts to have a slowed growth typically. Typically, it involves mature trees or trees that are reaching basically almost senescence for the site and for the conditions it's growing under. In pine decline, what happens is you may have some trees, especially on lands where we're trying to carry trees for long rotation. So we're going for, we're talking over 30 years for loblolly in some cases. These trees start to have some slower growth, and then maybe you have a drought or burning and the fire gets a little out of control and you get some damage. You'll get these secondary bark beetles that Helastes, for example, that will attack trees that are weakened and in the process of senescing, and they will bring with them various fungi that are also secondary. None of the fungi that have been that I've seen in the literature so far are considered primary pathogens. They don't move through the root grafts or root systems in the South. At least the southern species that we have in the South so far have not been shown to move through root contacts or root grafts to affect a living adjacent trees. At least the data so far does not indicate that. Whereas with Heterobasidion irregulare, that fungus actually is a primary pathogen. It is in the air. There's high amounts of spores, and so it will grow through those stump, through the root contacts, and can kill adjacent trees. So you're dealing with totally different things. Sometimes, unfortunately, when people look at a pine stand and they say, well, it's declining, they may not be diagnosing the problem. So with pine decline, you need to figure out what the primary causes are. Like, why is this stand falling apart on you? Is it age? Like, is it 60-year-old sand pine on a high plateau? And in that case, it's reaching the age in which it's going to senesce, and you need to clear cut it and start over. If you're dealing with younger stands, you probably are not dealing with an actual pine decline. You may actually be dealing with some type of problem. For example, I see loblolly pine planted on these deep sandy soils, and loblolly is like a weed. It can grow almost in anything when it's young. But as it starts to age, and if you get a severe drought, then you're going to start seeing beetle spots occur in those stands. I don't call that pine decline. I would call that drought with ips beetles or southern pine beetle or whatever is getting into the stand. So I don't know if am I going off topic here, or did I? Yeah, so they are different, and I guess I just ask that you look a little closer to the spots that you're seeing to determine if maybe you're actually dealing with a root disease. And think about, when's the last time a stand has been thinned? Has it been 4 years? Has it been 3 years? You might actually want to dig around and see if you have Heterobasidion root disease, or Annosum root disease, or Fomes, or Annosum, or whatever name you want to call it.
Great, and one final question came in. Is there any research on power borax applied to stump after cutting?
I haven't heard of that treatment. You have to have a label. Power borax. I'm a little I don't understand. We used to have a powdered, if you meant powdered borax, yes, that used to be available, and that is no longer available. The company won't support a label that allows us to use it on stumps. The only borax treatment or borate treatment that I know of that you can use is the Cellutreat. You could use Cellutreat as a powder if you wanted to. The key is you've got to keep it from getting wet. And that may be hard. It will get, if there's any moisture in the air even, it'll start clumping up on you. So it can be kind of a problem from that standpoint, but you could possibly use that as a powder if that's what you're talking about.
And is Heterobasidion root disease in New England or only in the South?
Well, okay, so this root disease is throughout the Northern Hemisphere, and that includes all of North America and Europe. Into, I think, well, anyway, it's definitely throughout North America. So we have Heterobasidion irregulare. Out west, we have both Heterobasidion irregulare and Heterobasidion occidentale, which Heterobasidion occidentale is found more often on spruce and fir and hemlock. There's a whole list. But anyway, so we do have two species in North America, but the Heterobasidion occidentale is found out west.
Okay, I think that's the end of our questions. So again, we'll thank Ms. Cram for her excellent webinar. And if everyone online, one more late breaker. Will the presence of Heterobasidion root disease shorten the life of longleaf? This particular person is planning on taking longleaf to 60 years.
Well, only if you get in a colonization in your stand and it's affecting your stand. It will. So Heterobasidion irregulare, when it's going through your stand, it takes 10 years once it's infected, and it will affect its growth, and then it will also kill trees and make it susceptible, easier for bark beetles to attack. I would recommend that you use stump treatments when you thin.
All right, thank you, Michelle. And this webinar will be made available to be viewed on demand, probably since we have a holiday, probably looking at the first week of December or shortly after the holiday. We'll get this up and going. Bear with me, Michelle and I are going to switch spots, and I'm going to push out the proper survey links so folks can take their survey to finish up their continuing ed credit things.